stand with this tradition at least for the next 12 months, I hope. Thank you. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. I'd like to welcome everybody to the meeting and appreciate your attendance as well as all the commissioners and of course the Game Fish staff and all the employees. Thank you, and please at this time, if you would, shut all your cell phones off or at the very least vibrate. So I'd like to remind everybody, if they'd like to address the commission, they must do so with filling out of a blue sheet. And if you can fill this out and give it to Tara Hodges back there, the Game and Fish Regional Office, it would be very, very nice. We'd appreciate that very much. At this time, when you fill out the blue sheet, we're probably going to limit that to 2, maybe 3 minutes. So please address the commission in the best shortest time possible. So we're behind schedule. So welcome and thank you very much. I'm going to turn the time over to Brian.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Our new director, please. I'm sorry.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, members of the commission. And I would like to actually start the morning here by recognizing our 2 new members of our commission. We're very fortunate. Governor Gordon has made exceptional decisions from my perspective on our 2 new commissioners. Richard Ladwig is from Manville, Wyoming, Niobrara County. Say again?
Big town.
Big town, it is, yeah. If you've never been to Manville, I hope that you'll go and find Manville on the map and go spend a little bit of time there. Don't look for a hotel, but it's a great place. And
it's on the map, right?
What's that?
I don't think it's on the map.
But Commissioner Ladwig comes with a lot of diverse background and experience. He's retired from being a serviceman in the Air Force, I think 22 years. He spent 20 years as a Niobrara County Commissioner. He served with the Wyoming County Commissioners Association and several of their offices, including president. And he now is a small business owner, or has been, I guess, for quite some time. Owns a feed store there in Manville. So
I've sold it.
Oh, he sold it now. Okay. So, but anyway, he's got a great background, great experience to be on this commission and to do the great work that this commission is charged with doing by our state statute. Secondly, Ralph Brokaw, rancher from Arlington, again, another very highly qualified commissioner. He actually has had this interest for a couple of decades since his father was interested in being on the commission. He ranches near Arlington, cow-calf operation, has a beautiful place there. Actually started off, he was when he was a young lad, he went to school for a couple of years at the university and majored in wildlife management, went home to run the ranch. He's been very active in the Wyoming Association of Conservation Districts and also his local conservation district. He's been on the board of supervisors there for, gosh, as long for a couple decades, so a long time. And he served, he's the past president of the Wyoming Association of Conservation Districts. Also had the opportunity to serve at the national level with that organization. So 2 great commissioners. Really appreciate having you on the commission. We had a good day yesterday of giving them the first of 2 days of orientation, which is drinking from a fire hose for sure. We gave them a lot of information. It had some really, really good discussion too. So welcome to the new commissioners. So we have here today a lot of Game and Fish staff. Yesterday we had the opportunity to introduce the senior staff to our 2 new commissioners. And in the interest of time, I think since we got that done yesterday, we'll just move on with the agenda here this morning. I do encourage the commissioners to take the opportunity. We have a lot of the local Cody field personnel here in the room today and on breaks and at lunch. Please take the opportunity to talk to some of our field people. They'd be glad to visit with you and tell you anything you need to know about Park County. I didn't see any legislators, but I do know that we have Park County Commissioner Lee Livingston here today, and I appreciate Lee being here. He says, welcome to Park County. He's always glad when we come. He usually shows up. And we have former commissioner, not very long that he was a commissioner. Norm Groskopf is here too. Yes, he's still here. All right. And did I miss any legislators, county commissioners? So with that, Mr. President, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Brian. At this time, we'd like to follow Brian.
Thanks. Got it. Yep.
At this time, we'd like to have elect the new commission president and vice president.
I would move that we nominate and elect David Rael as the president of the commission.
Second that. So, any other nominations?
I would move to nominate Pete Doobie as vice president.
It is a motion by Commissioner Craig to elect myself, David Lyell, as president of the commission, and who seconded that? Dalen, to Commissioner Dalen seconded that, and it was any discussion? Can we have a vote? All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? The ayes carried. Yes, I'm the new president. Congratulations. Can we entertain a discussion on the vice president? I think it was nominated by Commissioner Mike, or presented the nomination Pete Doobie for vice president. Was there a second? Galen second. So it was moved by Commissioner Mike Smith to elect Pete Doobie as the vice president. It was seconded by Commissioner Galen Bird to say. So, all in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? The ayes carried. Pete Doobie, new vice president. Congratulations. I have a famous, but I'm nervous as hell. We need to approve the minutes for January 24th, 2019, February 8th, 2019, February 11th, 2019, February 22nd, 2019. Can I so move? Second. It is Commissioner Pete Doobie that has, Vice President Doobie that has motion to accept the minutes. And it is seconded by Commissioner Pat Crank to approve the minutes. Thank you. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? The ayes carried. I will now turn the time over to our good director, Brian Nesbitt.
All right, thank you, Mr. President, members of the commission again. I'll take about 10 minutes here to run through, I think, some important issues that are ongoing right now with regards to the department and some things that have happened here over the past couple of months since our last commission meeting. So first of all, we just finished up the legislative session. There has been some discussion yesterday and a little bit today on that session. And tomorrow, Scott Smith is going to provide a good detailed report of particular legislation that was directly related to the department, some of the impacts and some of the things that the department's going to have to do. But I will have a couple of things here today too that I'll just briefly touch on that are as a result of the legislative session. You know, one of the things that I did want to report to the commission too is we had the opportunity to work with the new leadership team, both with Chairman Miller in the House and Chairman Driscoll in the Senate, and a very, quite a few new members on both of those committees. It was great working with those folks. They were interested in our issues, and I look forward to the next couple of years working with that committee. I think it's going to be a good relationship, and we're off to a strong start with them. One of the things that I know is certainly important here locally, and that was part of the legislative session, part of a bill that was passed. I think this was the third, maybe the fourth time that this legislation has been discussed, and that was on providing the commission authority to regulate antler hunting east of the Continental Divide. Legislation saw saw a couple of amendments, but at the end of the day, it did pass. And so one of the things that we will be doing, and it doesn't actually take effect till July 1, but between now and July 1, we'll begin to have some discussions around the state about where both the public and the department have felt like we need to have some discussions about antler hunting seasons. And then we'll be, talking much more about potential regulations after the legislation is in effect July 1. But I did want the commission to know that, we've already started hearing from folks about their concerns on both sides of the issue with antler hunting, and the department's working on that now. One of the things that this commission authorized several months ago, a year ago actually, is the allocation of some resources towards the fiscal feasibility study. And that's the first large piece of that work was completed largely by our fiscal division leadership, as well as some of our field staff over this last about month. They spent, I think it was a week here, maybe a little bit more than that, conducting a lot of interviews and getting a good start to that process. And it's ongoing, and the report back from our leadership in the fiscal division is that's been received well and is going well. We continue to have discussions with the other states, as well as with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, on what Wyoming next steps may be with regards to grizzly bear, where we're going to go in the future. Wyoming, as you are all well aware, did file an appeal back in December. We haven't heard for sure yet if the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is going to file their own appeal, but suffice it to say, we are working diligently to try to figure out the quickest path for management of the grizzly bear to return back to the state of Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho, where it belongs. The commission is well aware, but I thought it was important to bring up again the fact that the department is closely watching and anticipating a decision by the U.S. Supreme Court, the state of Wyoming versus Herrera. That's a decision that will certainly could have some potential impacts on wildlife management in Wyoming. And so our communications team has done a really good job of putting together an article that was in the Wyoming Wildlife magazine here recently, and we continue to have discussions across the state with our publics about what that decision could mean for our state. Many of the members of the commission remember the last time we were in Cody, we talked about bighorn sheep in Du Bois and some of our disease concerns there, as well as some of the other public concerns that we had with regards to just sheep management and a decline over a lot of years with bighorn sheep in Du Bois. That collaborative process has begun, and you're going to hear some more detailed information on where that's all at here at the commission meeting. But that's a good step, and I think there's going to be some good outcome to having unified publics and department on where we move forward on bighorn sheep management there in the future. Additionally, speaking of collaborative processes, you'll hear today from Mary Wood about where we're going to go in the future with regards to furthering our messaging and our efforts with regard to CWD, and certainly a huge component of where we go in the future, and a huge part of our success will be defined by our abilities today to educate our public on really what the disease is and what the potential ramifications are. There have been, and I know Commissioner Smith's been involved in this, you may recall a year ago, there was a statute that was passed that gave the commission authority to do away with or to regulate once-in-a-lifetime mountain goat hunting licenses. And that the intent behind that was to let the commission, in places where we may want to discourage mountain goat occupancy, to be able to do that with and make sure that they were going to be able to have folks that would actually put in for a license that would provide probably a low chance of success, but an important wildlife management tool. And so we've started to have some discussions about that and figure out where that's going to go. There's you'll see some things in April. But along those lines, there's also been discussion, and it's been important, an important issue in the northwest part of the state with regards to Grand Teton's plans to remove and reduce mountain goat populations in the park. And the department's been very involved in those discussions, and as has Commissioner Schmidt, and so has the public. And so we continue to work forward on that. Don't have the final outcome or any, don't have that figured out yet, but I did want the commission to know we've been very engaged in that. Last thing I'll talk about here today is the fact that we've had some good initial discussions, and we'll have some proposals, or at least one proposal, I think, for the commission in April regarding a short-term wildlife crossing project. And this commission has in the past demonstrated their interest in doing more with not only not just migration corridors themselves, but also the component of migration corridors across highways. So we will be continuing to look at that. There's been some good work that's been done between the department and the Wyoming Department of Transportation to identify maybe the highest priority locations in the state to focus work on that issue. And the work has begun, and we're gonna work hard to try to get something done in the short term on that. So with that, Mr. President, I would certainly answer any questions that any of the members might have.
Brian, I've got one question. One question. Mountain goat situation. They're not a native of Wyoming.
They're not. They do well though in some of our habitats.
Yes, they do. Thank you.
I would like to publicly congratulate Mr. Nesbitt as the new director of the Wyoming Game Fish Department.
Thank you.
Sound improper or disrespectful, but I generally call people their status and first name instead of Director Nesbitt. I said Director Brian. He chooses to not let me say that. I will not say that, but I'm sure. So, in any event, we'll move on to agenda item number 5, which is Scott Edinburgh, the acting Chief Wildlife.
Good morning, all. Commission President Rael, Commissioners, Director Nesvik. It's a great honor and privilege that I'm here today to do one of the finest things I think a chief or any employee can do for their employer, or for an employer can do for their employees, and that is recognize those that shine above others. So with this time, I'd ask South Dakota Game Warden Grant Gerharder to come forward, and if his wife Nicole would like to come forward and be up front, she's more than welcome. She's being bashful. So we're here this morning to recognize Grant as the 2018 Shikar Safari International Wildlife Officer of the Year. Annually, Shikar Safari recognizes one state wildlife law enforcement officer for their outstanding achievements nationwide. And this year, Wyoming's selection is South Dakota Game Warden Grant Gerharder. Grant was nominated by his peers and supervisors, so that goes a long way as well. It does not come from the top, it comes from the bottom up. So that's a great way to be nominated, Grant. I'm gonna just read a couple things from his nomination. Here's some of the things that your fellow employees had to say, that those that wrote it and that were then evaluated through Wildlife Division Administration and totally support this nomination and Grant receiving the award. So here's what your fellow employer or your fellow officers had to say. Grant is an extremely dedicated and passionate employee who works tirelessly to protect Wyoming's wildlife resource. is a staunch advocate for wildlife resources, sportsmen in the Wyoming Game Fish Department. As an accomplished horseman, Grant spends a great deal of time in his district's remote and vast backcountry, which is the thoroughfare. For those who do not know, that is the most remote country in the lower 48 states. This has also earned him the respect of the sportsmen and outfitters in the area. His law enforcement effort is exemplary. Violators and would-be perpetrators have come to respect his relentless and thorough but fair approach. His outstanding investigative and interview skills are used to solve wildlife crimes that otherwise may not have been ever solved. Juggling wildlife damage, enforcement, wildlife management, public education, large carnivores, and other aspects of a busy district can be tricky. However, Grant's attitude, and always described as positive and polite, with his work approach being fair and flexible. In conclusion, whether it's volunteering for a task force, assigning another work unit, or assisting another work unit, building relationships, handling trophy game conflicts, finding ways to maintain healthy big game populations in his district, or considering how he can best meet the needs of his constituents, you can always count on Grant. So with that, Grant, it's proud and an honor to present you as the 2018 Shikar Safari Wildlife Officer of the Year. Grant will receive this computer plate with the Shikar Safari logo on it. His name will be engraved on a plaque at the Cheyenne office, so the other officers of the year. He'll have a pin that also goes with that, a certificate from Shikar Safari recognizing him as the officer of the year, and a personalized letter from Shikar Safari acknowledging you and thanking you for your work.
Thank you very much.
So if you'd like to say anything.
Well, President Royale, Commission, Director Nesvik, I never fathomed that I'd be standing here. So thank you guys for this opportunity. And I remember during the application process, a lot of us glossy-eyed folks staring up at it was Chief Nesvik. And I remember at that time, his words were, "This is the best job in the world." And I found that to be true. So thank you guys for this opportunity. You have a great thing going. All the amazing folks that work for this agency, and they are directly responsible for any of the successes that I have along this way. So thank you. Thanks guys for the nomination. I appreciate that perception. Thanks to the Cody region. Appreciate all the support. And oh, my wife, the unquestionable support she provides. I don't know how she does it, but thank you. I wouldn't be here without you. And the best. Thanks, guys. Yeah, go.
We together. Come away from that screen. To your right, or your left, you guys' left. You guys are not standing above the screen. No, I mean all of them. Everybody come over here. I don't know which way it is, but it's the right way. He would do that.
Yeah.
He would do that. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Grant. Cody, another reason to be proud of all your residents. Thank you for hosting this event. So, at this time, we will go to item agenda number 6 in Marywood. And I believe Hank will also, it's all Mary. Okay. We'll presentation on the chronic wasting.
Commissioner President Real, Commissioners, Director Nesbitt, as Commissioner President Real said, we'll now have Dr. Mary and Jessica Western come up and present. It's basically a two-part presentation. One, as I stated yesterday, will be an update on our CW efforts, where we're at, where we're going, followed again by Jessica Western presenting a little, for better word, training session on our collaborative process, which we are starting to engage in for the next year. So with that,
Sorry, Scott.
that's nope.
Well, good morning, President Real, Director Nesbitt. First time I've said that, and members of the commission. Appreciate the chance to talk to you guys today about chronic wasting disease. For those of you who were with us yesterday, we did provide a bit of an overview and background of chronic wasting disease as an orientation for new commissioners. This certainly is a pretty complex disease and complex issue. So today I wanted to talk to you a little bit about just an update on our 2018 surveillance, just to show you what we're seeing on the ground with CWD. It will be maybe a little bit repetitive for those of you who were here yesterday, but then we're going to move on into moving forward. How are we moving forward with chronic wasting disease in the department? So, and then once I'm done speaking, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Western to talk to you a little bit more about collaboration. So just to start with our 2018 surveillance and monitoring program. Our focus this year was to get good sample sizes from 9 specific herds. And we're using some of that data to put into a bigger research project, trying to understand management of deer and how that impacts chronic wasting disease. And that's a project that we're doing collaboratively with all the Western areas that have a long history of CWD. So we were able to get some really great sample sizes from some of those herds. And then certainly we also focused on trying to continue to survey for detection of chronic wasting disease in new areas. So for what we saw this year, I think I've probably shown this chart multiple times to the commission. Really, we tested over 5,000 samples this year, over 5,800 samples this year. And it was the most samples we've ever tested actually in the history of our program. Just above some of our peaks back in the early 2000s. And it's an incredible effort that is put forward in order to do surveillance for CWD. And you know, you look at this chart and we see the sort of varying levels of surveillance effort over time. A lot of that's associated with funding. But the reality is even 6,000 samples when you're trying to survey white-tailed deer, mule deer, moose, and elk in an entire state, it doesn't necessarily end up to being a lot of samples if you're trying to survey the whole state at once. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about future directions. We did certainly find chronic wasting disease in some new deer hunt areas this year. Most of those areas are places where they're sort of surrounded by known CWD positive areas. What was probably most notable this year was a detection of chronic wasting disease in a roadkill deer in Grand Teton National Park, which certainly led to quite a bit of concern about westward movement and spread of the disease. We also found CWD in several new elk hunt areas this year. Again, these are areas that overlap known positive areas in deer. And I'm not trying to downplay when we find chronic wasting disease in new areas. It concerns us. We certainly are concerned about it. But it also is not necessarily a surprise because we certainly do know a lot about this disease and how challenging it can be to detect this disease early in new areas. So a lot of times we're just a little bit behind the curve and kind of finding areas. But we certainly are always concerned when we're finding it in new areas. So we have now that, and especially the last 3 years, we've started upping our surveillance again, trying to get some new prevalence estimates and trying to look at some trends over time. And I'm just showing you a few of these herds where we're focusing and trying to include these herds in research where we've got a bit more of a long-term data set. And it is a bit concerning because in areas where we had historically considered it to be relatively low prevalence areas, in more recent years, we're seeing prevalence increase actually quite a bit, especially now when we're getting some good sample sizes. So our Platte Valley mule deer, Upper Powder River mule deer, Cheyenne River, Southwest Bighorns, those populations were all seeing prevalence increase quite a bit. And that is concerning. In our core endemic area in southeastern Wyoming, where historically we've had the disease the longest time, And we've been trying to monitor this disease over time. We're seeing, you know, I guess a few different pictures. Our Goshen rim population prevalence has gotten pretty high, over 40%. Our Bates Hole population, we're seeing prevalence increase up to around 28% there. What's really interesting is our Laramie Mountain mule deer population. You'll see that we actually did have prevalence increase and hit somewhere around 40% in adult buck deer. But we actually did have a dip in prevalence. And this is an area where we actually have the best sample sizes out of this population. We do think we actually did have a dip in prevalence there. And so that's why it's going to be really interesting for us to include all of this data into a broader research project. Helps try and understand, well, why did prevalence decrease in this area? That being said, it looks like it's maybe starting to take up again. We got really good samples this year. Our South Converse mule deer herd is the population where we have had the highest prevalence. So we peaked at around 49% prevalence in adult buck deer. That prevalence dipped a little bit and seems to be kind of holding around 40%. Our sample sizes are a little small here because our harvest is a bit low here. So we're going to keep monitoring these populations over time, and all of that data is being included in a broader effort to try and understand the trends we're seeing and why we're seeing those trends. One other thing we started looking at just this year, really looking at some of our data and looking at what we're seeing on the ground. And I've talked to you guys about this before, where we seem to see more chronic wasting disease in buck deer than we do in does. And we seem to see more chronic wasting disease in mature buck deer than we do in does. And the question really exists, well, what happens to those buck deer over time in a population? And talking with a lot of our managers on the ground who are working in these areas where we have populations that have had high prevalence of chronic wasting disease for a long time, so a lot of disease pressure for a long time, noticing some disturbing trends when they're going out and flying over these populations and classifying them, where we seem to be seeing some of these older age bucks dropping out of that population. So when we're flying over an area that has 30 or 40% prevalence for a long time, versus an area that has, you know, less than 10% prevalence. There's a visible difference, at least from our manager's perspective, in how many big mature bucks they're seeing. And we did start to look at some of our classification data to see whether or not that kind of held true. And it does seem like it's a pattern we're seeing in some of our data as well. In this graph on this axis, we're just looking at class 2 or 3 bucks. So those are bigger, more mature bucks that have a bigger antler spread. And then on this axis here, we have prevalence of chronic wasting disease. And just looking at several herds over time, it does seem like our herds that have higher prevalence of chronic wasting disease, particularly high prevalence for a long time. Even in our classification data, it seems like we're seeing less of those mature bucks. I will give you the caveat that our classification data, this is management data, it's rough, it's raw data, it's not perfect. I wouldn't necessarily put all of my stock into that data, but I do put my stock into our managers on the ground and what we're seeing when they're flying these populations. So that's an area we're going to be looking at, certainly as we move forward and continue monitoring these populations. So that's all I wanted to talk to you about surveillance today. I just kind of wanted to give you an update and overview on what we're seeing, but I also wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the people that make this program possible. You know, folks in our laboratory often don't get a lot of acknowledgement for the incredible skill and technique and knowledge that they have in order to conduct our CWD testing. And our laboratory meets some pretty rigorous international laboratory standards in order to be certified to conduct CWD testing along with a lot of other disease testing. So these guys are quite skilled, quite knowledgeable. And I'm learning from these guys every day. And I also think it's important to acknowledge our field personnel. You know, you look at 6,000 samples, seems like a lot. Look at it statewide, then it starts to seem like not a lot. Boy, it is an incredible effort for our folks on the ground. It seems like, oh, if this is hunter harvest, these should be just flooding into us and it should be really easy to get lots of samples, but it's not. It takes a lot of time and effort and boots on the ground by our people to achieve that.
Dr. Mary, before I forget, you mentioned the percentage of prevalence we have in the deer. Herds. Does that constitute 40% of a herd being infected or 40% of what you're testing?
Yes, that is a very good question, Mr. President. So what we're looking at when we're measuring prevalence, because we need to be able to measure something that's comparable over time. And our harvest is heavily focused on males. So when we make our estimate of prevalence, we're making our estimate of prevalence in adult male deer. When we estimate prevalence in elk, we actually combine male and female because we don't see a difference in estimates. But when we're talking deer, we're talking adult buck deer. Yep. So just wanted to take time to acknowledge the incredible effort that goes forward by our field personnel and our laboratory personnel to make this happen. I can come up here and put points on a graph and do some stats, but these are the folks doing the actual work. And it's a lot of effort that they put into getting us some data to understand what's going on with the disease. So now I'd like to shift and move on to talk about where are we going. So where's our future? So we have an internal chronic wasting disease management team. We've been working together on chronic wasting disease for a couple of years now. We've got a bunch of things that we've got going in the works right now. So we're working a little bit on internal communication. We're working on revising our surveillance and monitoring program. We've got a hunter survey going on right now. And we're starting a pretty big statewide collaborative process. So I'm just going to walk you through each one of these things, hopefully relatively quickly, just to get you up to speed on where we are and where we're going. One of the big things we are trying to focus on with our team now is that internal communication and discussion. You know, as I've talked about before, we are kind of making a shift in our message and a shift in how we're looking at approaching CWD, and that's a change. And that can be difficult, you know, both for our public and for our own agency folks. So we've expanded our management team so we have better representation from across the state, better communication from our team back to the folks in the agency, trying to make it more of a two-way street so we get feedback from our own field personnel as well as providing our field personnel feedback on what we're doing. So we're really working on trying to do a little bit better job on internal engagement. We're making some videos from folks who are actually working on the ground in areas with high prevalence of chronic wasting disease, trying to get some more discussions open internally. We're also looking at potential areas for chronic wasting disease management in two different ways. One, we're actually looking at what are we doing right now? What sort of management do we have on the ground right now? And are there areas where we're doing maybe different or interesting management that we need to actually paying attention to try and see if we can tell whether or not that's having an impact on chronic wasting disease. And then we're also looking at other areas across the state where we do have chronic wasting disease and whether they may be areas where management could be considered. And if so, what could that look like? Really just some preliminary discussions trying to look at some of those. The next thing we're doing is working on revising our CWD surveillance and monitoring program. And we talked about this during orientation a little bit yesterday. Historically, our programs have been really focused on detection of disease in new areas. So we're always kind of trying to go and find the disease where we haven't detected it yet, and not necessarily intensively monitoring the areas where we have detected it. Now that we have CWD pretty widely distributed, and now that we're talking about potentially doing some form of management, we would like to shift the focus of our program to more of a long-term monitoring focus so that we can start to get good data, good sample sizes, you know, in all of our herd units so that we can kind of track what this disease is doing over time and have a better understanding of how this disease may be impacting our populations and also to inform management. You know, I 100% agree that doing surveillance and monitoring is not necessarily doing management on the ground, but we're going to need this data in order to inform management, in order to tell us where should we be looking, where should we be focusing, and are we being effective once we try and implement management. So it's going to be still a pretty important part of our CWD program moving forward. And one of the reasons we're doing this shift, so this is just a prevalence map, specifically on our mule deer populations. Darker blue is higher prevalence, lighter blue is lower prevalence. But we have all of these areas here in yellow. And all of these are areas where, unfortunately, our sample sizes, at least over the last 5 years, are not large enough for us to make an estimate of prevalence with even really coarse confidence. And so we just don't have a good feel for what prevalence is in those areas because most of our surveillance focus has in the past been trying to detect the disease in new areas. So we want to change how we do our monitoring program so that we start actually systematically monitoring the disease in all of these areas. So what we're looking to do is just a rotational monitoring where each year we focus on certain herd units and we're going to rotate that throughout the state and hopefully cover the entire state in about 4 to 6 years. This is actually a recommended approach to monitoring chronic wasting disease in endemic populations in the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies Best Management Practices for Chronic Wasting Disease. And so by doing a rotational program, we can collect the same number of samples that we're collecting now, but focus where we're collecting them. And we can get really good data, you know, with our existing laboratory resources without overburdening our lab and trying to do too much. And we can monitor this disease pretty effectively. So that's what we're trying to sort out the details on how to do that and how we are going to do that. So that's being worked out right now. And certainly this is another map just showing in elk, where of course we have those same issues, where we have a lot of elk areas where we know we should be monitoring maybe more closely, but you know, just don't have the sample sizes to try and make any estimates at this time. But we hope that we'll be able to change that and get some good data as we move forward. So the next thing that we're working on right now is actually a hunter survey. So we have sent out a survey to hunters on chronic wasting disease to try and get some feedback from our hunters, little information about their knowledge base, what are they thinking about management, what are their thoughts on some potential management strategies, and also how do they want to be informed by us on chronic wasting disease? How do we most effectively communicate with them? So this is a pretty big survey effort actually, and it's going to be open. We've sent that out to about 3,000 hunters. 1,500 of those are hunters that are hunting in areas that we consider to be higher prevalence, over 10% prevalence. 1,500 of them are in areas that we consider lower prevalence, so 5% or less. And that's a mix between resident and non-resident hunters. And we're hoping that we should have some preliminary results from that survey in April and May. And that's going to help provide us some information in this broader public process that we're going to do. And this is a survey that was actually built by Colorado Parks and Wildlife, their human dimension specialist. And he was kind enough to share it with us, and we modified it to fit Wyoming's needs. But we should be able to also look more broadly at a comparison between the two states and hunter attitudes, interests, and knowledge level. So hopefully we'll be able to bring that information back to you guys in the future. Okay, so the big thing that we've really got going and really just getting started right now is a bigger, broader, collaborative public process. And I've talked many times about chronic wasting disease and about how important public support will be in our ability to implement any management. It really is critical because anything we're going to try, we need a long-term commitment, you know, and that's going to have to be a commitment from our agency, from our commission, and from our public. And what we've learned from other states who've tried management is that if they don't have public support, and we don't have public support, we're not going to be successful. We've spoken with all of those folks that have tried management, and that's first and foremost what we say is you need to work with your public. So we would like to do that and move forward and do a pretty big, broad public engagement process related to chronic wasting disease and management in Wyoming. I am not an expert on communications, collaborations, and big public processes. That is not in my wheelhouse. So, you know, we really felt we wanted to do this right, and we wanted to make sure we did it well. And so we're partnering with the Ruffles House Institute at the University of Wyoming to help us put together that process and facilitate that process so we can get really a good process going. So Dr. Western is going to talk to you a little bit about that after me. The goal of this process is going to be, we're going to create a statewide CWD working group, and they're going to help come together with some recommendations for management for consideration in an updated CWD management plan for the department. And so we're looking to get, you know, as many different voices and people with backgrounds in different groups to the table to come and work with us to try and develop some recommendations for moving forward with management. So right now we're in that initial process. We just released our application for this, I believe, on Tuesday, and that application will be opened until April 5th. Anybody can apply to be on the working group, but we are looking to get a group of people with diverse backgrounds, representing diverse groups, and get all of these folks to the table to kind of help us. We do want them to be able to go through all of the actual data, scientific information, technical information, and public feedback, and consider all of that and collaborate really in good faith to work with us to try and find some recommendations for management in Wyoming. And then moving forward, once we've got that group chosen, which I believe we'll review applications in April, and then applicants will be appointed by the director in late April. And then we are moving into our kind of bigger, broader public process, which consists, I guess, of 4 main phases. And our first phase is internal. So our first phase is still coming back to our own agency personnel, meeting with them, talking about why we're going down this road. You know, what are we seeing? Why is it important to collaborate? How do we collaborate effectively? So we're going to do that at the end of April internally. And then our next phase is going to be a public engagement process. So we would like to go out to our public, and we're going to do that in a series of 5 different public meetings where we're going to go in different locations and try and provide some information and updates for our public on what is chronic wasting disease, what are we seeing, why are we concerned, and what are some of the newer management recommendations that are being put out there in recent years, and solicit feedback from the public. And we're going to ask our working group members to attend at least one of those meetings. So our public is providing input and feedback to the agency, but also to the working group to take all of that information back and consider it in the bigger, broader process. Then our phase 2 schedule, is late May and early June. And those meetings are going to be in Laramie, Casper, Sheridan, Moreland, and Pinedale. We've got all of those scheduled now. Our next phase would be actually going into the working group process itself, where that working group is going to get together over a series of multiple longer meetings, take all of that information into consideration, all of the data, all of the research, all of our feedback from our public, from our survey, all of that into consideration to try and put together some recommendations that we can use to update our chronic wasting disease management. Those meetings are scheduled for July, August, and September. They will be 3-day meetings, so it's an incredible time commitment for the folks who are going to do this public process. And then phase 4 is kind of a wrap up. So once our working group has put together those recommendations for us, we will take those into consideration, revise our CWD plan, review that all internally, because we need internal support as well as external support. And then we're going to go back to the public and present that revised plan. So in all the places we were in May, we're going to go back to in December and talk to them again and let them know what we came up with through that process, give them the opportunity to provide feedback again. We'll ask those working group members to attend at least one of those public meetings so that they can hear some of that feedback as well. That working group will meet in February for one final meeting to make any changes based on that feedback. And then we hope to have a final plan for you guys come March to present to the commission. Public meetings for that phase 4 will be in the same locations as the meetings in May, and that final working group meeting in February. So as we do this statewide process, we really want to look at chronic wasting disease in Wyoming as a whole. We want to look at the big picture. We want to look at the whole state. We don't want to ignore feed grounds because feed grounds are a significant issue. We also don't want feed grounds to be the only part of that statewide process and conversation. So while they can be discussed during that process, it's only one piece of the big picture of chronic wasting disease in Wyoming. However, we recognize that feed grounds are a difficult issue, and we are concerned about feed grounds and chronic wasting disease, and we are concerned about what might happen when CWD actually is found in those elk on feed grounds. So we don't want to walk away from feed grounds at all. We just felt that they actually needed their own process because there are so many complex issues surrounding feed grounds, and there are multiple disease issues beyond just chronic wasting disease. So when our statewide process is done, we do want to follow that up with some local working groups to do a public process related to feed grounds and disease in particular, so that we can develop more specific recommendations for that situation. So certainly feed grounds are going to be a big part of this as well, but it may be a little bit more focused when we get to that local process. Other things that we have going on, just as a quick review, we do have multiple research projects, collaborations going on. We have that bigger multi-state research project that we have a grant for looking at CWD outcomes and management in states with a long history of chronic wasting disease in the West. We hope we'll start getting some preliminary analyses from that data maybe this spring into summer. So that's moving forward. We do have a collaborative project going on with Dr. Holly Ernest with the University of Wyoming, looking at mule deer genetics and genomics statewide, trying to get a better understanding of what are we seeing in the genetics of our deer in relation to chronic disease. We are doing a collaboration with Montana, where we're looking at a couple of deer populations right across the border from each other. So 2 different deer populations that are right near each other, but have very different management strategies, and working with them to collaborate and evaluate that management over time so we can see whether one or the other strategy is having some sort of an impact on chronic wasting disease. So we're just starting with that one. We're doing some smaller localized population studies in our sort of core endemic area, trying to get a better feel for where chronic wasting disease is affecting populations and how that is playing a role in broader population dynamics. So we're collaring some deer. We have collared deer in our Bates Hole mule deer, our Sheep Mountain mule deer, and then this year started a big effort in the Elk Hunt Areas mule deer. So that's work we've got going on right now. And then we have a captive research project at our Thorne Williams Wildlife Research Center, where we are looking at timing of shedding. How long are elk with different genetics shedding that prion into the environment. So those are the different research projects we have going and collaboratives we have going in addition to this sort of bigger process. I believe that is all that I have for you. Happy to take any questions specific to what I was talking about before we kick things over to Dr. Winston.
Mary, I think it's a great idea to include the public and various people you are trying to try to get this working going with. I think it's safe to say that Wyoming is very proactive. CWD sit down along the sidelines and watch this thing decimate our deer. We can be proactive and do what we can to maybe not eliminate it, but at least manage it. So, appreciate your work. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Board.
If the prevalence is higher in adult bucks, and it takes a couple of years, 2 to 3 years to show up, why are they not getting it when they're young? If it's a social type disease where they from saliva and interaction, and when they're younger, they're with all the does and all the bucks. And I don't know what age you're talking about as being adult. How come it's not getting when it gets to that stage?
Sure. So, Mr. President, Commissioner Dewey, it's a good question. And it is. We do see chronic wasting disease in younger bucks, and we've even seen it in homes. So it's not that it isn't there in those sort of age classes. I think the reason we see it more in those mature bucks 3 years on is they've had more time for exposure. And so it's just enough time has gone by that they're just more likely to have that exposed. But we do try to the best of our ability to monitor prevalence in other age groups. Particularly, we're looking at yearlings right now. And I mean, there are some areas where prevalence in yearlings is quite high, which is concerning for what that means for the future. So they certainly are infected at those younger ages, and we do see it at those younger ages. I think the older ones have just had more time to get exposed to become infected.
Does that not carry over to does? A lot of times does are much more as a population. So they carry over there, and we know less about that.
Yeah, so Mr. President, Commissioner Dewey, that's a very good question. And it's a question I have too. In Wyoming, we have very little doe harvest in most areas, so we don't have good sample sizes from does to really understand what is happening with does. You would assume that the same patterns would occur in does, but from areas that have done a lot of work or have a lot of harvest in doe deer, this is work in Colorado and Wisconsin and Alberta, seem to pretty consistently see that the prevalence in their does is about half that of bucks. It's not true everywhere. By all means, it's not true everywhere, but it is a pretty consistent pattern. And we don't know why that is. I think we could theorize about it. We honestly don't know why it is we don't see as much in does. But in Wyoming, we just don't have the data to look at it because we don't get harvest of does to test on it.
Yeah, I know in our area, most of the testing is done in the beginning of the season. And then doe season is towards the end. That's the end of the season. So should we possibly try to find a way to do more of that, or you just think we have enough?
Yeah, well, okay, Mr. President, Commissioner Doobie, that's a good question, and probably something that can be explored through that statewide working group process. I would love to have more data and better data on does. The question is whether we have enough harvest to get that data. And so I think those are conversations we have during our statewide.
Mr. President, Dr. Wood, talking about the adult buck mule deer, has there been any study or any work done? I mean, because it's so prevalent in adult bucks, mule deer bucks, has there been any work or any thoughts on could it be caused from stresses due to the rut? I mean, where they got themselves in such a depleted condition that it gives this disease an opportunity to really take off and go.
Yeah, so Mr. President, Commissioner Schmidt, that's a good question. There is research that's going on and modeling work trying to understand why that is. And there are a lot of theories. So one might be partly during the rut, whether it's related to stress or whether it's just related to the number of animal-to-animal contacts that they're going to have during the rut, or whether it's related to some sort of different behavioral patterns in male deer and when they're in some of these buck groups and animal-to-animal contact in that context. And then there certainly is question on whether some of what we see actually has to do with harvest, where we do have a higher harvest intensity on our bucks than on our does, and whether there's something we're doing during hunting seasons that in some way is impacting movement and contact of animals. And there's some question on whether there's just some inherent characteristic that makes males more susceptible than females, or something related to the prion itself. There's a lot of questions there. I don't know that we have the answer. We just have a whole lot of theories.
Mr. President, I mean, we have this collaborative process going on here, trying to figure out what maybe what you said several times that it's going to require a long-term commitment. Can we expand on that? What is long-term? Let's assume that we decide to have an extraordinary harvest of male buck mule deer in a particular area. That's the management action that we ultimately choose to try. So you mentioned a long-term commitment. So can you explain more what you envision there? I mean, long-term 10 years, 50 years, is it 1 year?
Yeah, so Mr. President, Commissioner Craig, that's a very good question. And the long-term commitment, at least from the recommendations that have been developed for management, those recommendations suggest that management should be applied for a minimum of 5 years and probably evaluated every 5 years. But there's a good chance you're going to need 10 years even to see impacts, to see an effect from some of the management strategies. So it is a long-term commitment as we're looking at a minimum of 5 years, but preferably 10.
Wow. So that, I mean, and I don't say wow in a negative sense, but I think the public needs to understand that. If we're going to take an management action that may have some effect on this serious disease that's affecting our well effort. We talk about a commission and a department and the public. Are going to have to buy in on we're going to take this action with regard to a particular mule deer for 5 straight years. What that may mean to that composition of that herd.
Mr. President, just another question for you, Dr. Wood. I was kind of looking at some stuff nationwide about CWD, and Wisconsin seems to be kind of hotbed for CWD. But I did notice that in Wisconsin, that what they call their southern farmland zone, that's where the heaviest concentration of their CWD seems to be. But yet, since the day they were started monitoring back in 1999 to 2016, that herd unit, or that zone, has actually increased by 60% from 160,000 to 270,000. And I also noticed in one of our reports here from 2017, we took about 3,900 CWD tests that year. And of those, 342 were tested positive, but 262 of them were mule deer. So those two comments kind of tells me that CWD really hits these mule deer more so than white-tailed deer, elk, or moose.
Yeah,
or is that just because we're looking at mule deer hard?
Yeah, so Mr. President, Commissioner Schmidt, that's a really good question. It is a really good point to make about chronic wasting disease. There's a lot of work that comes out of Wisconsin, a lot of research, and a lot of data that comes out of Wisconsin. You know, when you're looking at chronic wasting disease in the Midwest and the East, you are looking at a white-tailed deer dominated system with high densities of deer. And it's really a very different picture in those areas than what we're dealing with in the West, where we have mule deer, elk, moose, white-tailed deer kind of all overlapping in ranges. Our densities are not as high as the deer densities are, you know, in the Midwest and in the East. And we do feel that in the West, our predominant CWD kind of species is the mule deer. That being said, we have quite a bit of CWD in white-tailed deer too. We just don't have quite as much data on white-tailed deer. So I think when we're looking at numbers of positives and how many of those are mule deers, some of that is reflective on samples that we're getting, not necessarily the amount of disease in those populations.
Mr. President, right? Am I right that there's a, I think the legislature is going to vote on Friday, but there's a potential for an interim study topic for the travel recreational island?
Yes, Mr. President, Commissioner Crank, what we've recommended to TRW is kind of along the lines of what Mary's talking about today, with educating all of our publics, including legislators, to provide them informational presentations throughout the interim. We're not really asking them for a bill. Doesn't mean that they won't see a need in some way, shape, or form to draft one, but it's more of an informational presentation than anything.
It seems a recurring theme here in a lot of your answers is regarding sample size. It just appears to me that that might be a critical problem, is just we're not getting enough samples. Even though our sample size is high, it's not anywhere near high enough to what it needs to be. That's something that I'm sure is something the working group is going to be talking about. But is that something that the Department of Commission should be trying to address to get more samples?
Sure. So, Mr. President, Commissioner Davey, that's a good question. And you're right, you know, our sample sizes are not ideal in a lot of areas. There are some areas where we have very good sample sizes, and there are a lot of areas where we really don't. And I really hope that we're able to address that issue by shifting our program and shifting the way we focus our surveillance and monitoring. And I am hopeful that we can achieve good sample sizes that way in order to address some of those data gaps. Because I think the reason for sample size issues really has to do with the program focus, and we're going to change that focus in order to get that data. So I do think we are hopefully working to address that now internally and be able to move forward and get that data.
One more question. You know, some of the previous commission meetings we've had touched on CWD, and it's always astounded me how, you know, we've got high prevalence area down in the southeast corner of the state, and all of a sudden one remote case pops up in Du Bois, and then the next meeting it was over in Pinedale, and now we've got one up in Grand Teton National Park. And maybe you're not the one to answer this question, but who determines what animals get tested in this case? I know the one in Pinedale, if I remember right, was found in someone's yard or something, near a hole.
Yeah, I believe it was just south of the, there by the airport, south of the subdivision is what I recall.
So I was just curious if that was just a random choice, or somebody actually seen the deer kind of suffering the effects of CWD and it died and decided to test it. I don't know if you can answer that question. This one in Grand Teton, same thing. The person that hit that vehicle, is there a reason that that deer was tested?
Sure. So, Mr. President, Commissioner Schmidt, that's a good question. And as far as decisions on testing, you know, a lot of that comes down to, you know, opportunity. So we come across a roadkill animal and have the time to go and collect that sample, then, you know, our folks really do try to do that, particularly in those areas where we have not detected the disease. Same thing goes for animals that look sick. You know, if we get a call out on a sick animal and we go and remove that animal, you know, we usually test those. And that's a lot of times how we find those early cases, is actually looking at sick animals and roadkill animals. So in Grand Teton National Park, they actually do a good job of sampling roadkills. You know, the Park Service really does, and they do a good job of sampling elk that are harvested out. So that was just Park Service personnel who saw a deer and took a sample.
So they sample pretty much everything they come.
I believe so.
They do. Yeah, they do. The Pinedale one, do you remember, Scott or Doug, was the Pinedale deer, was that a targeted removal, or that was targeted, meaning somebody reported it and Parkville people looked at it and said, yeah, there's something wrong with it. Yeah, removed it.
Thanks.
So real quickly, Dr. Wood, maybe the department can answer this more than you would. When did we start testing for CWD?
So that's a good question, Mr. President. So we started as an agency, we started testing for CWD in 1997. Prior to that, between 1982 and 1997, Dr. Beth Williams did quite a bit of research on chronic wasting disease. She's the one who kind of first discovered, described this disease, did a lot of that early research and information on the disease. So we did work with her doing sampling in those early years, but our agency program started in 1997.
Where was it found?
Mr. President, I believe that, well, our first case was in our own captive research facility, the Thorne Williams Research Facility. Our first free-ranging case was in mule deer, and boy, forgive me if I'm wrong, I believe that was in Laramie Mountains mule deer. Do you know? I believe it was in our Laramie Mountains population.
Real quickly, the reason I bring this up is because years ago, Commissioner Frank Rosen, I believe, Director Brian Rosen, a friend of mine over of ours in Hewlett invited us to mule deer hunting over at his place. I'd never seen a check station. It's between Hewlett and that the town of Hewlett and Junction.
Yeah, that was it.
Yeah. And I've never seen one of them. I guess that was back in 2001, 2002, maybe. But now it's become an issue. It's become a real prevalent disease that needs to be addressed. I know we're doing the best we can, but we need to.
Thank you, Mr. President. I appreciate your support. I'm hoping we can convince perhaps one of our commissioners to be on our CWD working group. So maybe that is something we can consider for you guys to apply.
Mike's a good candidate.
I do have one question.
Okay.
And I'm going to expand on a comment that Richard made yesterday.
Sure.
You had how many tests this last year? 5,000 or so?
Mr. President, Commissioner Schmidt, 5,845.
So nearly 6,000. And I remember some comments yesterday that were made that, you know, with the lab, it's kind of limited how many tests you can take. What is that number? Do you have any idea how many tests? And maybe we talked about that yesterday, but I can't remember.
Yeah, Mr. President, Commissioner Schmidt, that's a good question, and we have looked at that and considered that. Right now, we think our capacity is probably 8,000 samples.
8,000.
Can you give us a rough idea, Mary or Hank? How do we expand that capacity? When we talk about a new lab, forensic lab, other facilities, we need to expand it. How do we expand it?
So, okay, Mr. President, Commissioner Craig, that's probably a big question. Probably a big discussion on how to do that. We have thought about that in leadership work. You look at expanding into other laboratory space, you look at the laboratory. I think there are a lot of considerations that would have to be a broader discussion, certainly with our administration.
think at the end of the day, Commissioner Crank, right now with the existing lab space, if you'll see in the budget presentation that there's an additional couple of technicians for the lab. With the existing lab space, 2 more technicians, I think that's where Mary has arrived the number of 8,000 samples. To go beyond that, I think it requires in some way, shape, or form additional physical space to do the testing, whether that means expanding into another part of the health or the lab that they're in now, whether it means going to a new space, which requires a lot of national certifications and a whole bunch of logistical challenges. Those are all the things that Mary's talking about that are, I think, have to be discussed. It means more space, though. To answer your question in very short, it means a bigger area to do that.
And probably more field personnel.
I think that's consequential to the answer to the first question.
You can collect samples if you don't have a laboratory.
Exactly. Exactly.
Mr. President, I have a couple more questions. I think I read somewhere where a test costs about $30, somewhere in that range.
So Commissioner Real, or President Real and Commissioner Schmidt, it depends on what test you're doing and it depends on where it's done. So for us to do it, because we do it in-house, costs us about $17 a test.
That's all the labor involved.
All of the materials, not necessarily the labor.
My second question is, and I made a comment about this yesterday too, in the discussion after your conference. Is there any thought to, and maybe it's not even feasible, might just be a crazy thought, to develop some type of a quick test, a field test that every hunter can carry, and maybe not detect that this animal has CWD, but it's maybe in the stages of or could come to some degree to give the hunter some kind of an idea. You folks, what we're seeing out there.
Sure. So, Mr. President, Commissioner Schmidt, that's a good question, and there are people who are trying to work on putting together more rapid tests, maybe tests that use different sources of tissue and things like that. But it is pretty challenging to develop these tests and have a good test where you have good confidence. And these testing programs are overseen by a larger overseeing testing body to assure that they actually do have good quality control, good standards to make sure those tests are accurate. So while work is being done to move towards that, it's a difficult thing. And so far, I have not seen anybody who's been successful in creating a super ultra rapid test. You know, the one we have, you know, still can be done in the laboratory in, you know, about 6 hours, but we still have to do additional testing to confirm that, just to make sure we're giving people accurate information.
And kind of the thought behind that for me is more for the hunter's sake. I mean, there's no record of this being transmitted to humans yet. But it is recommended not to eat a CWD beer, so it's kind of a safety measure for just for the public. Okay, thank you,
Mr. President. $17, that's just the initial screen.
So I think Mr. President, Commissioner Crank could answer that. That be everything?
That would be the initial test is around $12. By the time we do all of our confirmation, additional batches. Okay, so the total cost to do every bit of testing we do on the deer to notify the hunter of CWD is about $17 per test. I mean, total, that's the average.
Real quickly, I'd like to mention too, Dr. Mary, that not to confuse the public, but the new lab we recently built in Laramie has nothing to do with the lab that Mary and Hank put in and their staff. So, if Commissioner Frank brought up a good point, we need to, as this thing grows, so will your staff and so will each of you. So, I want to make mention of that so the public doesn't think that we just built the brand new lab, talking about building something else, and maybe we're not talking about that yet, but it's going to come down the road.
Well, if there are no further questions, I think I'd like to go ahead and turn things over to Dr. Jessica Western with the Rumpel's House to talk to us a little bit about collaboration and why it's important to do that and some of her area of expertise and how she's going to be helping us out with this effort.
Thank you, Mary.
Thank you, Dr. Wood.
Thank you, Dr. Wood.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Jessica Western. I'm with the Rumpel's House Institute at the University of Wyoming. We are in the Haupt School of Environment and Natural Resources. My specialty is, my discipline is social psychology in relation to natural resources, so human dimensions in natural resources. A long time ago, I was also a forest ecologist. That's a whole nother bottle of wine to talk about that one. But what I am here going to talk about with you is collaboration. I'm director of the collaboration program in natural resources. And we have had the great pleasure of training quite a few people in Wyoming Game and Fish Department in collaborative problem solving and collaborative leadership. I'm delighted to be working on this process, and I'd like to give you a little bit more information about what it is and what it's not. So first, I'd like to give you a short history of natural resource collaboration. Then I'd like to go into some of the principles that go on behind collaboration. And then I'd like to go into this particular collaborative process. So in the 1980s and the 1990s, collaboration or multi-party negotiations, there are various ways of talking about it, but we generally call it collaboration, as in to co-labor. And in the 1980s and 1990s, this became an important tool because the whole field of natural resource management, not just in this country, but worldwide, became more and more complex. And issues were bouncing around between various arenas without any resolution, and that did not solve problems either. Part of the things that were contributing to this was democratization of science. The older model was that agencies and universities were the purveyors of scientific information. That changed over time, and other institutions and individuals and organizations were also providing very valid and reliable data. There's increased participation, especially in the United States, by additional value sets. Demographics have changed. With that come additional value sets. And then without this resolution, because of this bouncing around, without resolution, there was a lack of trust among all interests increased, which wasn't helping things either. So collaboration emerged in the 1990s to include as many interests as possible and to build consensus around options that meet as many interests as possible. So our definition of collaboration that we use is the process and structures of public policy decision-making and management that engage people constructively across the public, private, and nonprofit sectors in order to carry out a public purpose that could not be otherwise accomplished. Very often the idea being that Game and Fish, in this case, Director Nesvik, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but I don't think Game and Fish all by itself can tackle CWD. It needs all hands on decks, and as Dr. Wood was explaining, support from your constituents is going to be really critical in this. So collaboration is ultimately a form of negotiation. It's two sides to the same coin. And collaboration is simply a negotiation among many parties. All the people, all the stakeholder types who feel like they have an interest in this issue of chronic wasting disease, they will be included, as Dr. Wood was explaining. It's FOTE, as we call it, a full, open, and transparent exchange. Negotiation in this sense is a positive sum game. It's not a zero-sum game. And I'm going to be illustrating this in a little bit. To make positive gains, one must help other people meet their interests as well. In other words, collaboration is a way of creating value. And to demonstrate this, I would like Mr. Edberg to please. If you hear an accent in my voice, it's because I'm originally Dutch. If you want to speak Dutch fluently, I'm your girl. If you're not, that's okay. It's a really ugly language. I love it, but it's not the prettiest. At a certain point in my life when I was young, I lived in a small village in the Netherlands called Beuzegem. And if you look it up to this day, it has the world's oldest horse market. So this is at one point, one year, my father decided to go to the fair, go to the horse fair. I came with him. He decided to start the day by having a couple of pints, as one does when it is fair day. He came out of the pub and decided he was going to buy his little girl a pony. So the way horse trading goes in the Netherlands is what we call handje klappen. So handjes, klappen. It's hand klappen. Scott, if you wouldn't mind putting, what would you, let's say that Scott is selling this pony. I'm my father. Scott is selling the pony. Scott, what would you like for the pony? What would you like for the pony? How much?
200.
200. Okay. 100.
175.
150.
140.
It's deal. Thank you.
Let's not let him negotiate this.
Yeah. So that's handje klappen. And so basically that's what we mean by a zero-sum game. It's one or the other. You know, I'm either going to buy the pony or I'm not going to buy the pony. It's the same with cars. It's the same with houses. Collaboration is different. And this is how I'd like to share it with you. Let's say Scott, let's call Angela, Angela here. Angela wants to have a certain amount. This is her direction of satisfaction. I am John, and this is my level of satisfaction or direction of satisfaction. Angela wants to have at minimum that much. That's her reservation value. I want to pay that much. That's my reservation value. So somewhere, if we ignore things, if we just make it about the pony and nothing more, then we'll probably wind up at that point, which was in this case around 140. If Scott had gotten what he wanted, the 200, then it would have been at that point. If I had been able to get what I wanted, 100, then it would have been at that point. So somewhere in between those points, there's going to be a compromise. It's a fairly simple compromise, and it's called what we call a distributive solution. What collaboration does is expand the pie. What could have happened is I could have asked Scott, why do you want to sell this pony? And maybe Scott would have said, well, it's my daughter's pony. She is sick. The money that I'm paying for hay for the pony right now, I could really use for medical bills. Maybe I would have said, gosh, I think my son is going to the same school as your daughter. In fact, I think they're in the same class. Maybe I can help out with taking your daughter to school. Maybe we can help each other out here. We wind up really agreeing that we like the school, we want to take care of our kids, and at a certain point, it's not just about the pony anymore. It's about something bigger. It's about our children, it's about the health of our children, it's about our household budgets, and we have expanded the pie. At that point, Scott might have made us say, oh, go ahead, take the pony for 120. So then he will have sold the pony, I will have gained the pony, but we will also have been able to help each other out in other ways. We will have been able to meet other interests. And the way that I did that, I opened up that pie, was by asking one simple question: why? So often we don't have a chance to talk with each other and find out why we're saying what we're saying, what is important to us. Commissioners, I've been hearing you asking Mary questions, and then you provide explanations about what your thinking is behind that, which really helps my learning in the audience to understand where you're coming from and where you might be going, and therefore what kind of solutions there might be available. So that's what collaboration is all about. It is an opportunity for people to come together who have common interests, i.e. in this case, chronic wasting disease, and from our different perspectives, be able to put all the solutions, all possible options on the table. And that's what we are going to be doing with this collaborative process, because it's important to the entire state. It's very important to you, obviously. All options need to be able to come up on the table, and we've designed a process that will allow that to happen. So how we do this is the consensus building process. First, we identify what are the problems or issues. We identify why are the interests, why is this important to you. Then we identify all the options. We're going to put all the options on the table. And then we're going to explore trade-offs. Which options meet as many interests as possible is usually the way we go about it. So translating this draft into this process, I'll get back to that one. There are going to be a number of phases that Mary talked about. The first phase is internal. Make sure that within the agency that everyone understands what the purpose is, what the process is going to be, and address any concerns, hopes, and dreams that people have internally. Then we're going to go to phase 2. We're going to look at the issues. We're going to look at the problems. What are the interests? We're also going to start exploring with our publics in those first 5 meetings, what are ideas that the public has for solutions? Then we're going to go into that intensive working group, and that's where people, as Mary was saying, are going to have to be willing to really look at technical data, scientific data, and come up with options and explore the trade-offs and draft recommendations. Recommendations for, I think it's an updated chronic wasting disease plan. Then we go back to the public, to the same 5 places. We discuss these draft recommendations, find out whether the public has any questions about it, and help make sure that the public understands why these recommendations were drafted and why they will be presented to you. And also, who knows, very likely the public might have some additional good ideas that we can add. So in that last working group meeting, they will fine-tune things and fine-tune that plan, and the deliverable is going to be draft recommendations to leadership and to you that are grounded in public deliberation and science, as well as what is the agency's capacities? What can you do, short-term, long-term? So this is a big lift, and I just want to go back to this slide. What collaboration is not? It's a heavy lift. You don't use collaborative solutions seeking for every issue. It's for the big stuff. So it's not quick. It's not cooperation. It's not colleagues working together. We should be working together. It's not always cheap. It's never the same. It's different every time because the issues are different, the place is different, the people are different, and it's never simple. You don't use collaboration for simple things. It's used for the wicked subjects. It's for the complex subjects and for the contentious subjects. That's when you use this. So that's all I had to share with you. I just wanted to share these photographs with you. Director Nesvik was referring to the bighorn sheep process, the Whiskey Mountain bighorn sheep process in Du Bois. We had the science panels last week, and on February 11th, we also had an additional public meeting, and these are the pictures of the breakout groups. We had about 50 people there, and it was incredibly positive, and the public came up with great ideas and great issues. And may I help you with any questions? May I answer any questions?
My wife and I are thinking about buying a car. Will you go with us?
I'm good at collaboration, Mr. President. My husband does the car thing too. Any other questions?
Mr. President, I might just add, we've had the opportunity to use Dr. Western on multiple collaborative learning processes going back probably 10 years now. Wyoming Range Mule Deer Initiative, Flat Valley Mule Deer Initiative. Now she's doing the big worm sheep work. And anyway, we've got a track record, and it's been successful every time we've used this process in Dr. Western. So I'm very optimistic. This is the right thing to do.
Thank you.
Great presentation. Thank you, Donnie. Okay, we have a call to the public. Nicole Walker.
Good morning, gentlemen. Thank you for listening first. I enjoyed the presentation of you, President Wyoming Commission, for this opportunity to speak. As y'all know, some of you know, I started out this summer with a raw dog food company out of Wild Game, and we were looking to do value-added waste collection, or take that waste out of the landfill. I've been in processing for 4 years around Jackson, and it turns out one processor equals the amount that YDOT and Game and Fish put in the landfill. So just Jackson's Game and Ice equals the amount of volume y'all put in the landfill. So we were looking at solutions, and we started collecting based on some understanding of that it's edible, so we were doing everything correctly. And of course, CWD was found in Teton County. So that CWD is the primary, and they all came back to me and said, you know what, you can use antelope, you can use bison, you can't use CWD surveillance and use transport. So what we did was that caused us to look at the whole process, and we went to our lab that's doing our pathogen testing and asked what it would take to do CWD testing. And we also started looking at inventory tracking that's used in USDA plants across the country, larger ones, and started talking to our processing industry on the domestic side. CWD is one of the reasons rendering is not in Wyoming. There's multiple reasons, but that's one of them. They address the collection of it by saying we don't take anything that's tested positive. So if a county tests positive, they don't come into that county or that processor. So what's happened is and Dow and the rest of the state is looking to ship cattle to Taiwan. They have found they don't know what to do with 50% of the animal. Typically, the other half of the animal goes into dog food or pet food of some sort, pet treats. And what's happened now is I said, okay, well, what does that look like? So we started doing the research on prions and sanitation and what are they using for mad cow, what are they using in dental associations, those kinds of things. And it turns out ozonation kills prions on surfaces. And I had originally asked guys at the local wardens, what do you do? We've had CWD forever, come from the south, and we process. And if it lives on the equipment, then it's contaminating the domestic. Any processor that processes both domestic and wild game potentially spreads CWD. So I asked if you needed more testing, and the labs, we don't have enough lab space. We don't have enough funding. We didn't see a lab head barrel until November at Jackson, which is the end of the season. So I was like, well, what can we do as processors? Because I've been processing for 4 years. What can we do to help y'all? And I could talk about the solution, but we talked to a group of agency representatives last Friday from Fish and Wildlife Services, Teton County. Brad Hovinga from your office was there, Ben Wise. And there are incinerators that are used by the state of Indiana. They're highway patrol, or not highway patrol, YDOT, so IDOT, these same incinerators, I'm not doing anything new, we could put in every county that we have a processor in. And because my employees are already doing sanitation and waste disposal, we operate those mostly. And one of the concerns and why this has been such a big issue is around incineration. They'll have takes multi-million-dollar to build a facility and put that together. You don't have enough money for testing is an issue. How do you collect more data? So with the tracking software and beef chains blockchain technology, we have found a way to collect more samples or do more testing and not burden your state lab. Turns out the university labs like University of Minnesota, Kansas State, all have CW testing available for it's $4 a test, or $7 for 4 test kits, and $28 for the sample. Like, so once I run that, we turn it back. So it's about comparable to the $30 y'all were talking about earlier. Xterra is willing to be the central collection point and distribute it. So I'm waiting on their information to find out what that cost is. And talking to the refuge, they're interested in a decentralized alternative to CWD mitigation. We're looking at ozone sanitation at the end of the day, bringing what you see in USDA domestic processing, where they process beef first, then sheep, and then pigs last for contamination, cross-contamination purposes. We would move all the service to the end of the day. We have the ability to track from hunt area. So if our tagging, our SaaS system, our software talks to your software in your hunt base. It's tracked by the tagger, the hunt tag or ear tag from Rancher. We can identify and red flag animals from southern counties, so they can be processed last. We use ozone technology in the cleaning process, sanitize the plant, and then take that waste, anything from survey material, and we can burn it. We're already going to burn heads and spines. I'm interested to know, as they're developing more research, if it spreads from the spinal column and the lymph nodes first. If it's the lymph nodes in the back fat, we can collect. We don't always get heads in. We can collect. There's significantly large lymph nodes in the back fat. So if it goes to the lymphatic system first, then technically if that lymph node is negative, potentially the meat is not contaminated yet. Not saying that we'll get exact. So there's some research to be done. It's not, but we're willing as a company, Wyoming Wild Raw, to kind of man and operate and start this process. And talk about collaboration and interagency meetings. So what I'm looking for, what I'm looking for. What I wanted to tell, why I spoke to this now instead of a little bit later, I have some more information if you'd like it. But is we have an answer possibly to your sample size, developing more samples, and especially later season with the does. And we have potential testing opportunities in other places till we get something more solid developed in Wyoming. That's kind of where I stopped. The other thing is I don't know, you guys use IBEX testing in your CWD testing, and they use, I don't remember all the acronyms, hold on.
Cole, can I interrupt?
Yep.
Just a minute?
Yes, sir.
Especially when I explained that these blue sheets hadn't been filled out.
Oh, I apologize. I've done that. Was I just wanted, as a public, I'm signing up for the interagency commission thing on CWD. But the idea is that there are solutions, and the public is willing to support you.
I appreciate that very much, and what you're kind of asking us is to change the curriculum midst, right? That's stuff we have success right here, and I don't know about the rendering part of it. I know.
So what's happened is the processors have borne the financial burden of the impact. So they spend thousands of dollars in bags to bag the CWD to get to it. They pay for the processing, the waste disposal costs. And now that that's no longer available locally to any processor in Teton County, Sublette County, well, Sublette will transfer it for them, but we have to go all the way down to Kemmerer. So what's happening is I can this summer have test operational model within this area, and I have investors willing to do it if we're willing, but it costs about $2,000 a ton. So what it is we have all these pain points.
Are you talking about just the rendering part of it, or are you talking about testing the whole works?
We have a data, we will be implementing a database in wild game that you guys could use for whatever purposes you desire. And depending on the regulations or the interpretation of inedible, we can we can do the add to that testing, spread that testing cost out.
That would be a heck of a liability with snow now. You guys, if you're gonna say it's edible or not edible.
No, no, edible meaning inedible portions of the wild game. I'm not referring to, so according to the Department of Ag, edible is the hanging carcass, anything that's not awful aside from the main organs. And so it's hanging in the cooler. Yes. So inedible in your definition is, or edible in your definition is the spinal column or the back straps and the quarters primarily. So I'm referring to the trim off the hanging carcass, the bones, those kinds of things. And I'm actually not rendering, but it's, anyway.
Appreciate your comments.
Yep.
We do value the public comment and certainly consider what you.
I can get the information later.
A lot of information to digest.
It's a complex problem and it's a complex solution, just as she said. And so the reason I spoke now is because there is a need for collaboration among the public, the processors, and what I'm seeing is the processors are bearing the financial burden. You might disagree as far as the research is concerned, but when it comes down to waste disposal of it, we have a huge pain point that needs to be addressed. And so it's been spread out between different agencies, YDOT and the town and county. And so that's kind of where I'm coming from. So thank you so much, sir.
Thank you very much. Any more calls to the public? I only have the one blue sheet, so we'll go with that. And we're gonna break for dinner right now. Where we come from lunch and dinner, so break for dinner and